Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you everybody who is tuning in remotely to this live stream book launch of I Got a Monster by Baynard Woods and Brandon Soderberg. My name is John Duda. I'm one of the worker owners here at Red MS, where we've been closed for, hold on one second. Just making sure we're doing fine. Okay. So just making sure that our stream is up and running. Looks like it is. Like as I was saying, I'm here from Red Emma's in Baltimore. For those of you who are tuning in from out of town or don't know us, we're a worker-owned bookstore, coffee house, worker cooperative, event space, platform that's basically been totally shut down by this pandemic that we're all dealing with in different ways. And so we're really, we were really hoping that we'd be able to bring everybody together in person for this event. There's like absolutely nothing we love more than packing our space full of people to, all share space and share a room and share a drink and, just be able to congratulate authors when they release books into the world in person. Unfortunately, it just really doesn't make sense to do that at this point, and we decided to go online. And so we're really excited to not only be welcoming the authors of the book tonight, but also to be welcoming a really incredible panel of really amazing folks that I'll be talking a little bit more about later. I did want to just put a plug in here that, like, I know this is tough times for everybody. People are dealing with everything and doing it under really incredibly hard conditions. As you might imagine, independent bookstores are really hurting. Projects like ours that depend on the ability to bring people in and sell books and talk to them about books are struggling and are trying to sort of understand, is there a way out of this? And the way out of it that we know is the support of the people who value our stores and our spaces and the platforms we provide. And so I'm always incredibly excited when authors are generous enough and comradely enough to do their book launches with us, to encourage people to buy books through us. And I just wanted to take 1 minute just as a moment of appreciation for one of those comrades who recently passed, Michael Brooks, who was an incredibly stalwart supporter of our project. He had actually never even made it down to do an event yet. It was on the horizon. He was going to make it down, and then COVID struck. He was somebody who was a really incredible, just modeled. I mean, if you've seen anything about Michael Brooks, he was an incredibly generous, kind, wonderful person who a lot of people who created media that meant a lot to a lot of people, including to people in our collective. And it was really just shocking to see that he had passed. And I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate the support that he had offered to our project, and to just, can't thank him, but I can reflect that his contribution was deeply appreciated. Tonight, we have with us Brandon Soderberg and Baynard Woods. They are the co-authors of I Got a Monster, which is the hottest true crime / police abolition book of the summer. I'm really excited to be able to introduce them here and to provide a platform for them to launch their book to everyone. I am especially excited about this book because, first of all, it's compulsively readable. I picked it up on Sunday. I literally did not stop reading until I was finished, and didn't regret that in the least. It's a fantastic read. If I was felt safe going to the beach, I would bring this book to the beach. It's also, despite being a really fantastic read, it's deeply thought-provoking and deeply useful in this political moment. The reason we're doing this event here at Red M, is the reason we're excited to do this, is not just because Brandon and Baynard are awesome folks who we've known for a really long time, who have done incredible things for the city and created all sorts of incredibly valuable journalism and generally been like super amazing people to know and to appreciate their contributions to Baltimore and beyond. It's also because this book that they've written about the most corrupt police squad in America is actually really helpful in our current moment. There's a lot of debates right now happening around abolishing the police. And while their book doesn't directly engage with that, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about why in the discussion, what it does do is it makes it clear that when we talk about abolishing police or defunding the police, what we're not talking about is some abstract philosophical thing, right? We're not talking about police as a concept. We're not talking about police as the myth that has been packaged and sold and constructed and presented to us. We're actually talking about abolishing a very concrete historical institution that actually is really deeply fucked up. And their stories of corruption within Baltimore's ostensibly elite task force to get guns off the streets, I think is really instructive that the political task here is not fighting shadow boxing with a concept of police that we might have, but actually taking on the police as they are, as a historical institution that we have to deal with. So for that reason, I'm really, I find it really great to be able to have this event and to be able to have an incredible panel here to talk about this book with us. So we have with us today Lisa Snowden, who is the editor of the Baltimore Beat, an amazing journalism resource here. I'm also happy to note that she's now my colleague at the Real News Network, where she does incredible, super valuable work. We have Jenny Egan, who does also super valuable work keeping youth out of the prison system. She's a public defender, juvenile public defender here in Baltimore City. She also shows up in the book. We have Raleek Hayes, let's see who's joined us, who is one of the people behind Organizing Black, which is, if you haven't checked out some of the things they've done, I don't know actually what you've been doing, because if you've been in Baltimore, you've seen some of the things they've done, and they've been really quite amazing. Just some incredible activism at the forefront of the struggles that are going on right now against policing and prisons. So really great to have Raleek here. Larry Smith, who is was on the Baltimore Police Department, was a member of the Baltimore Police Department for, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, 17 years. And subsequently has left and is now kind of on Team Fuck 12, I guess. He's a frequent contributor to The Appeal and elsewhere, really chronicling some of the deep structural and systemic issues that policing presents as an institution. So a great kind of double perspective on the work that we're going to be talking about tonight. We have Stuart Schrader, who is the author of a recent book, Badges Without Borders, which we were also really excited to host the release for. That one was actually in person. It's really hard to imagine it thinking back, but it's a really great analysis of the way the political autonomy of the police was constructed against the backdrop of Cold War counterinsurgency. So I think a really fascinating kind of perspective to add to the mix. And finally, at least finally on my Zoom list of participants, we have Lester Spence, who's a professor of political science and Africana studies at Johns Hopkins, a fantastic scholar of the intersections of neoliberalism and racism, and generally all around awesome comrade in the struggle. So format for this is I'm going to turn it over to Brandon and Baynard in a minute. They're going to go ahead and talk briefly, read a little bit from the book, and then we're going to have some back and forth with all of the people who have been this really incredible panel that has joined us tonight. This is normally the moment when I'm introducing talks in person. I kind of just punt to like, okay, everybody join me in welcoming, and we get a big raucous round of applause. So I don't know, you want to toast, you want to clap at your house, you want to like type exclamation points into the chat that the authors can replay later. I don't know, but I am super excited to have these folks here to talk about this with us tonight. And if you are too, why don't you go ahead and buy their book, redms.org/books. You can go ahead, buy that book and support them and support us at the same time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon Soderberg.
Thanks, John. And thanks to Red Emma's for doing this. I mean, there's been a lot of complicated things really up to a couple of days ago. We still were really thinking about trying to do some sort of IRL event, and we just had to come to the fact that that's just not ethically responsible to do, even outside, even with masks. So thanks for being flexible and working with us on all this and figuring it out. There's a really cool zine as well that has 2 excerpts from the book and our op-ed in the Times that Redham has put together to kind of connect to the book and give to people who can't afford the book or don't want to buy books right now. Whatever you got to do, you have something you can get for free from Redham as well. So thanks. I'm going to try to run through this really quick, and then I'm going to hand it over to Baynard, who's going to talk a little and read from the book. So I thought that a good way to start would be to think about the creation of the Gun Trace Task Force as a unit. That's important for a few reasons. But before I get to that, I want to say real quick that one useful thing when thinking about this Gun Trace Task Force is that that's kind of just the name that these officers were, the unit these officers were working in when they got in trouble. They were doing plenty of other things in other units. That's just useful to think about. So when it's not so much about the Gun Trace Task Force as much as it is about Baltimore police officers and plainclothes police officers. These officers were in a lot of different units. They just kind of ended up in the Gun Trace Task Force when they got indicted, and so they became the Gun Trace Task Force scandal, that kind of thing. That's kind of important to think about. Kind of feeds, we want to combat that bad apples. Oh, it's just these 7, 8, or 15 guys or whatever, they're just the bad ones. So really, I think it's important to talk about the Gun Trace Task Force origins because it ties to a lot of things that are really thought-provoking right now and maddening right now. Like, for example, Bret Stephens talking about Baltimore in the New York Times over the weekend. So basically, in 2007, the Gun Trace Task Force is formed. It's formed in response to a massive zero tolerance policy put over the city in which hundreds of thousands of people were arrested over the early 2000s, kind of mass incarceration of the city. When you can look at some of those years like 2003, in which the police department was making about 100,000, 120,000 arrests in a city of over 600,000. That's just a staggering amount of arrests. And when you talk to public defenders and lawyers who were talking about working in that time, they'll tell you that jails were overcrowded, people were in there for open container, all kinds of bullshit. That was really a Martin O'Malley invention, or he brought that innovation to policing to Baltimore. The Gun Trace Task Force was created because in 2006, the ACLU was basically like, hey, Baltimore, you're doing a lot of unconstitutional policing. You need to think of better ways to do it, and be more strategic about it. You need to reduce arrests. You need to have constitutional policing. This is right when Mayor Sheila Dixon came in. It's also when a new commissioner, Frederick Bielfeld, came in. Them, in combination with some other police people in the department, had this idea that rather than arrest everybody, we would find the sort of bad guys with guns. We'd target these specific people. Kind of seemed like an innovation to policing, right? Sort of let's hunt with a spear instead of a net, as Bielfeld said to me when I talked about this. Sounds really great. But we know by at least 2017, 10 years later, these guys were indicted and they were part of the Gun Trace Task Force. So the Gun Trace Task Force is the idea for them in that sort of so-called focused crime fight was to go after people with guns and literally trace guns, like find a gun, connect it to other people, and go up the ladder the way you'd work a drug case. That coincided with this kind of concern, at least public-facing concern, that we needed to get away from drug arrests, which people started to really accept that the drug war was a failure. And we created what kind of became known as a war on guns. And what Baynard and I have talked about in op-ed was a lot like the war on drugs. It targeted the same people. So that's important to think about, because what you're going to hear, what you hear now is you hear a lot of love and celebration of this 2007, 2011, 2012 era, because the police department did 2 things. It reduced arrests and it reduced homicides for a brief period of time. And that's sort of always touted by even the piece that Bret Stephens was kind of quoting, Alec McGillis's piece, which I don't necessarily agree with his thesis there, but that's a piece of reporting as opposed to sort of a piece of bloviation that Stephens did. Anyway, so the idea was to focus on these guns, and that was the whole sort of plan, was get away from arresting a lot of people, arrest specific individuals. And that era has been really idealized. And what you start to see even now, I mean, I don't believe there was a single Democratic mayoral candidate in the election last month who didn't say, hey, we need to target the bad guys with the guns, And what they offer is a process critique. They're like, well, we had this idea, but something went wrong. we lost track. We weren't checking these guys. We gave these plainclothes guys all this sort of long leash to do whatever they wanted and arrest the bad guys. And then at some point we just kind of messed up, and that's what got us where we are now. I think another version of that is we had a very extreme response to violence that was different than the one we had before. We arrested a lot of people in a different way, and the result of that was a temporary reduction of crime that then people now tout all the time. So I think that's just really important to think about when you're thinking about this book, because that's what started the Gun Trace Task Force, that theory. And the central of that theory was you target bad guys. So all the Gun Trace Task Force did by the mid 2015, 2016 is use all that targeting and all that intel and all that sort of sophistication to target people to rob them instead. So you really see how this idea of like, look at the bad guys, share information about the bad guys with guns, focus on them, will stop crime, was just sort of bastardized by this unit. So therefore, that's just sort of like something I want everybody to sort of think about. It's kind of hovering behind the book. And this idea of targeting people just gets kind of changed and manipulated by the task force in particular. And they use all of that intel, all of that knowledge to rob people from everything from a few $100s to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they really live and die by that concept of you target people. And then that idea was really resurrected again after the uprising. And Baynard, I'll kick it over to you to kind of maybe catch up with that and read an excerpt. Ooh, he's muted.
All right, can you hear me here now? All right, great. See, I'm going to just read a short little passage that comes off of what Brandon said. It's going to deal with two people. I'll show you a quick photo here. Wayne Jenkins is going to be talking at first to his friend here, Donnie Stepp. And so since it's in the middle of the book, it's going to give last names rather than first names. So just to introduce who they are, there's Stepp there when we interviewed him in 2016. He was the bail bondsman that was dealing cocaine for Wayne Jenkins. And as Brandon was talking about, Jenkins, for a lot of his time of doing crimes, was in a lot of different other squads. The names, as Larry knows really well, the names of these squads just shift and shift and shift. And so this is when he's trying to take over GTTF, when he'd been running a squad with the SES, the Special Enforcement Section. Wayne Jenkins really needed a better crew. When he'd stop by Stepp's house to drop off drugs, pick up money, or plan heists, Jenkins regaled his bald, burglarizing bail bondsman buddy with crazy stories of the mishaps and close calls that made up the life of a corrupt cop. When Stepp was trying to become a bail bondsman, despite his felonies, Jenkins wrote a long letter commending Stepp's impeccable character. They laughed when the logo of Double D Bail Bonds, which featured a buxom woman whose breast hung down over the handcuff chains, pissed people off, and Stepp plastered the design across his truck. Stepp felt legitimate and powerful working with Jenkins. Drugs, hookers, dirt bikes, chop shops, guns. Jenkins was plugged into everything underground and illegal in the city while climbing steadily to the top of the legit world of police. Sometimes the commissioner called Jenkins when he was with Stepp, and they would put the call on speaker and laugh. The top cop was cuddling Wayne's balls, Stepp said. It was exhilarating and intimidating. Jenkins, who had fought a few short, victorious mixed martial arts matches under the name Silverback and now carried brass knuckles, had a short temper. At the high-stakes card games they attended, Stepp had seen Jenkins turn on other cops, ready to take them into the yard and fight them over the smallest slight. But it was all part of the package, and Stepp, like the Baltimore Police Department, thought the gamble on Wayne Jenkins was worth it. Jenkins had been talking a lot over a particular squad, the Gun Trace Task Force, an investigative unit collaborating with the feds to get guns off the streets by targeting people doing the shootings, the bad guys with guns, as then Commissioner Bielfeld, who created the GTTF in 2007, said. It was the kind of pill-to-pusher to plug work Jenkins had made a name for himself doing, only with guns. A war on guns like the war on drugs. Jenkins could get with that. GTTF also had citywide jurisdiction, which meant that he was no longer confined to a single police district. The entire city would be his if he ran GTTF. He almost took over the unit a few years earlier, but another cop, Thomas Allers, got it instead, and Allers has since been indicted as well. In 2016, with the homicide spike and Commissioner Davis's renewed focus on Bielfeld's bad guys with guns, Jenkins was getting hundreds of firearms off the streets each year. The whole department knew that because Jenkins would send emails to everybody in the department telling them every time he got a gun. As the murder rate steadily rose, command needed GTTF to do more. The unit needed to trace guns, but it also needed to be more aggressive in getting them off the streets. Jenkins could make that happen. With GTTF, he would also be able to handpick his own team, creating a sort of super group of grimy cops. With guys like Danny Herschel, Jamel Rayam, and Momadou Gondo already in the unit, the deck was stacked. He couldn't have asked for a more corrupt crew. It would be, Jenkins told Stepp, a front for a criminal enterprise. So that gives a sense of the moment that, as Brandon was saying, we see this as the GTTF scandal, and people get really obsessed with, well, what is it that made this squad so important? And the squad has taken on this sort of name of a gang, but all of these people had, one of the reasons we thought it was the most corrupt police squad is because they were all doing crimes separately and in separate units. And so Gondo was already working with drug dealers at this point, had been for a long time. Rayam was doing home invasions, all sorts of robberies as well. And Herschel had a long, well-known career here in Baltimore, which is actually how we first came to the story back in 2014, writing about the way that he was hassling the rapper Young Moose and using rap videos to get warrants to raid his house, which just seemed like a crazy First Amendment violation. And then we became aware of just these rampant Fourth Amendment violations that were everyday occurrence with all of these kind of plainclothes squads. So maybe go to the questions now. Yep. and get the discussion started.
Cool. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to, how about Lisa, do you want to ask the first question? And you have to unmute yourself.
Sure. So the question that I had for you guys, I know that as you were talking, as you were writing the book, Brandon, you kind of mentioned, that Ivan Bates was coming out to kind of be the essential player in the book. One of the things that I was thinking about, though, is how much we kind of have to fight back against maybe like lionizing people, or, we're always kind of yelling at folks for the way that if they aren't from Baltimore, how they maybe talk about Marilyn Mosby or Larry Hogan. When you guys were writing this, how did you kind of talk about how to make Ivan seem like a real person and not like, this savior for like Baltimore policing, like how you kind of address the things that just come out of being a human, and also knowing that Ivan, has been a politician. He's run against Mosby. He, could possibly run again. I don't know, but that's it.
Do you want to start that, Brendan, or I can take it?
Yeah. Sorry.
I mean, one of the things that was really appealing about Ivan as a character, I mean, first, one of the main things was that he had been going after Jenkins for a while, and then he had so many cases with him in the summer that we chose to focus on. There was a thread that went through, but he also is such his story was so interesting because he was on the other side of it in the Freddie Gray case, and he had defended Sergeant Alicia White in that case. And it was something that he was really conflicted over. And I find that being a conflicted person, and I think he was eager to talk about it, and in order to work it out for himself, some of what he had been through over that time. And then also when someone loses an election or a boxing match or whatever, the loser's locker room is always much more interesting than the winner's locker room because it makes you take stock of your life as well. And so those were some of the things that were appealing. And it takes this turn in the third part of the book when he starts running for office. These other people, public defenders, Natalie Finnegar and Deb Levy, sort of take over the role that he was playing in the first 2/3 of the book, and his role becomes a different role in the book. And so, I'm super grateful to Ivan for the number of times that I you know, the amount of times I had to call him to ask those details that show what the things that a human being go through and the kind of difficulties that people face. He really tolerated, and his whole family tolerated a huge amount of questioning like that. But I understand exactly what you're talking about, that concern of you know, you talk about a hero of a book, but you don't want to paint any human being as a hero. Everybody has all of their mixed qualities, and those are some of the things that he was really open about those things that made him an appealing person to sort of be that thread that took us through the book.
Yeah, and I would just add that, you know, something we did with Ivan was when we were writing those pieces, we were developing Ivan as a character, we realized kind of late in the process that he was kind of the protagonist. Originally, he was just a guy that had some cases. And then as we started to give the book to friends, they started to be like, you really need to push up your main characters. Jenkins, the main dirty cop, and Ivan, the lawyer that was going after him for a lot of his cases. We kind of had to be like, oh, we didn't realize that Ivan was a main character yet. And so that was part of it. And then once we realized that Ivan just happened to have a lot of cases during the time period we're looking at, that was helpful because when you read the book, it cross-cuts a lot. So we're kind of always looking for like, how can we jump from the cops to lawyers to jail, et cetera, et cetera. So Ivan worked with that. And then that also was, once we started to dig into Ivan and talk to him more deeply, we kind of saw that he was a great protagonist, but not a hero because he's complicated and his approach to all of this is as a defense attorney. And so we liked that he had the Alicia White case with the Freddie Gray was defending police, and he was doing this at the same time. And then the idea was to sort of show those things as kind of both sitting there and not also dismiss them as like, oh, well, he's just complicated in like kind of a simple way, but really dig into that. And that involved, especially on Baynard's side, really asking Ivan a lot and interrogating Ivan about that. And then the way we tried to check it as writers was, you know, it would always be like, I might read something, or he might read something after one of us had a conversation with Ivan. It would be something like, maybe we're a little too in the bag for this guy, or maybe there's something we got to change it a little, or this seems a little off. So we really tried to push each other. And I think that it was easier to really trust that we were doing the right thing because one of us was going to call bullshit on the other's sort of characterization. I mean, I think that was a key to the book, is making sure that no one is kind of idealized. And then we also had the other thing of it would just be that like, one of the sort of things that came out of the book that was sort of a rule that we didn't realize was a rule is like, you don't really hear from like formal elected officials beyond them in press situations. So the idea was to really pull back and reduce the amount of spin that we let into the book in a different way. Like, hey, like if somehow magically Marilyn Mosby had let us hang out with her and ask her questions, it might have been different. But we didn't expect that. We thought the book was much more interesting when it sort of eliminated the conventional understanding of the justice system where there's cops and lawyers and all that stuff. It was like, or prosecutors. And instead it was really this battle between cops and the defense attorneys that are trying to get these guys out of jail, get their clients out of jail.
Yeah, I mean, to add one bit to that too, the goal was to get inside the crime narrative in some way, the way that crime thrillers are so often propaganda for really authoritarian views about police. And since the cops were clearly the villains in this, to look at who was doing the work that would be that investigative sort of work. Some other people had written stories that were you know, following the Hartford County cop. And it felt a little bit like, oh, this white cop comes into the city and cleans it up. And it was that defense attorneys and public defenders are defending the citizens. And so it was really looking at that as an active thing. And so in some ways he stood in for, we dedicated the book to the defense attorneys who are defending the Fourth Amendment, because in some ways he was standing in as one person for, you know, every cop and every defense attorney in the city has a cop that they think is the cruddiest cop in the city. And, you know, some of them, that one happened to be Jenkins. That doesn't mean there are a lot of other really terrible cops out there as well.
Yeah, and really one more thing I promise I won't stop is like, it was also a decision because we were trying to work with the reversals of the story. And so the kind of thing you heard from everyone was like, isn't this an interesting story? All these drug dealers testifying against these cops. It's a reversal. And like, that's interesting for a few minutes, and that's a compelling way to sell the story. But we really wanted to sort of push that further. And when you start to look at people that are dealing drugs or working in underground economies, to stop thinking of them as criminals, but as another form of, as workers in a certain way. And another way to really push against the idea that public defenders are these sort of overworked, cynical people, or that slick defense attorneys are just slimy people, and in fact they're like doing the most important work, and in theory are holding the police accountable if anyone would listen to them, because they're really the ones that, like, rarely do prosecutors that are often working with police say, I have a problem with my officer. It's almost always a defense attorney being like, I saw the cell phone video and it does not look good, you know. So we really like this idea of pushing that reversal idea beyond the sort of typical binary, oh, now the bad guys are the good guys. It's like, well, it's more complicated than that, and really just undermining these understandings of victims and perpetrators, criminals and people who are quote unquote innocent, and then the idea of prosecutors and defense attorneys, just flipping that all around.
I'm going to turn it over to Larry Smith, former Baltimore Police Department officer and now trenchant critic of the police, to ask the next question.
Hey guys. So I want to take it back to something Brandon said in the opening. He pointed out that under O'Malley is when zero tolerance kind of really kicked in. And I think that's an important point, because that's when I started in the department. And that's kind of like the flashpoint for this type of policing. When O'Malley brought Ed Norris from the NYPD down here, that's when a lot of these units really began. And I'm curious what the guys think or what they found out in their reporting. You know, a lot of cops started out in these units, later became supervisors of these units, like Dean Palmier, Robert Quick, Sean Miller, Tony Barksdale. So as they move up the ladder and become supervisors, why does it seem that the buck sort of stops with Wayne Jenkins as the sergeant of the GTTF? I mean, he had commanders, he had supervisors. So I'm just wondering why you think that no one above Wayne Jenkins has yet to be held accountable.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think that one reason that the only reason Wayne Jenkins was ever held accountable is because they were prosecuting the drug war as they normally prosecute it. And they were going after Black people who were selling heroin to white people. And they happened to then, through that, get Mamadou Gondo on wiretap. And then through that, they happened to get to Jenkins. And so I think that they had to have fairly extraordinary evidence to get him even and to bring him down. And I think that, you know, as we've seen some of these cases going back with the robbery of Trinell Murphy, going back to 2009, where Vic Rivera and Ivo Lovato were charged just recently, that they were charged for lying to the feds about it because it was too old of a case. I think that one reason is some of those guys have been off the street for long enough, and that it's easy enough for them to say, I was looking the other way, given the evidence that they have. I don't know that the FBI I also don't know that the FBI and the US Attorney's Office are particularly interested in following it up. I do think that that D'Souza's takedown over tax evasion was clearly connected to this case. So I do think that that's some evidence that they were looking into them. You know, but that's something really, you know, I would love to know that as well. Really is, and I think that there should be a lot more accountability, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I can only speculate as well, but one thing I'd add is it kind of maybe goes back to that idea that I was talking about, that like we kind of siloed this as the gun trace task force, these 7 or 8 officers. And then, you know, every few months, another guy gets charged federally, and it's a story for a day or two. But the big story was these 7 at once. That's sort of what made it big news, at least briefly. And so in the same way that there was kind of, I think, a political reason perhaps to do that, to sort of silo it out and say it was these bad guys, it makes sense to me, at least. I would speculate that the kind of political decision-making that prosecutors make to be like, let's bring down these guys all at once, would be trying to decide it'll stop there, and that officers that are now in command and things like that will leave them alone. And then I think that the structure that I've kind of seen was that, and Larry, you would know way more about this than I would, of course, but I speculate, and tell me if I'm wrong, that like there were this sort of just look the other way stuff that Baynard also mentioned that sort of allowed a degree of, you could deny it or you could act shocked when it happened, as Commissioner Kevin Davis did. When we kind of have information, at least we had to have some sense of what's going on. And as lawyers have said, you simply would have looked at the number of arrests and gun arrests these officers were doing and been like, it's impossible to do that, like constitutionally. Like you can't do it. They're clearly doing something wrong, but they love those numbers. And so I think it has kind of that effect. And maybe it's like also like the Healthy Holly Pugh scandal here with our mayor who's in prison for selling children books as a scam to make a lot of money. It kind of stopped with her. It's kind of just, with higher ups, I think there's a tendency to be like, whoa, if we start going after these people, we got to keep going. And then that gets really dicey. I imagine there's something along that line. But it's a good question. I would really be curious why some of these commanders that really sort of raised these officers in a certain way have avoided any kind of prosecution or trouble.
And one more possibility on that. I mean, this investigation was begun when the DOJ was controlled by Obama. As Trump, the indictments came down after Trump was in office. But I imagine, and one of the two main prosecutors has now left. And we also got a new U.S. attorney here in Maryland. And so I think that the amount of resources that they're willing, given what we see the administration doing with policing and stuff, they're still making their cases, but they're pretty just seem to be based on proffers that the people they've already gotten are then giving. I don't know that they're going to put a lot of resources in this Department of Justice into going to take down. I think they're more likely to hire someone like a Paul Meir than really try to look too deeply into it.
So for the next question, I am going to turn it over to Raleigh Hayes of Organizing Black.
So I'm really interested in the fact that, around Baltimore, Baynard and Brandon, y'all are both known as the folks that criticize police, as, understanding that this is a very small media town. There's not a lot of contrary opinions from the stated opinion of the state and the police. When crafting this book, how did y'all think about dealing with that, right? Like knowing that a lot of folks will dismiss the book because it comes from you guys, right? It comes from folks that have always been critical of the police since I've known you anyway. And how does that affect the ability of this book to really, in some ways, be like a guide to why we should abolish BPD, right? Like it is a very deep, it's a lesson in why, even with oversight and consent decrees and things of that nature, like public safety as is just doesn't work. But I'm concerned that a lot of people will dismiss it because it comes from UT.
I'll start. I'm used to being dismissed by a certain amount of the population. So that's totally fine by me. But it's a good question. It's funny because when we began thinking about it as a book, we had something that was maybe a little more, like we were talking about people, like we were talking about nonfiction we really liked. We were also and journalism we liked. We're talking about someone like Maggie Nelson. And so the original idea of the book, in some ways, when we first were just sort of farting around together talking about it, was really like just kind of this discursive look at all this stuff in a big way. And so in that version, it was maybe not totally didactic, but it would have been more sort of as much telling as showing. Then as we dug into it, we started to really locate the narrative, and we realized that was really what made it interesting. And that also no one, because the story didn't quite have the legs nationally that I think we would have thought it would have, the fact that a lot of the information came up during a trial, which is kind of inherently, a trial sort of chops reality into little pieces, and then you get those pieces of reality based on who can come to trial that day and testify, et cetera, et cetera. And so we really started to realize once we started to put it in order, there was a lot of worth in just telling the story in order. No one had really done that. And so from there, And we also just realized that like this was a book, it wasn't an article. We weren't sort of seeing ourselves as much, you know, part of what we did at City Paper especially was, you know, you would kind of call bullshit on other people. And that's important. And I hear all the time, like, that's what people appreciated about City Paper was the good reporting and good writing, but also just like, hey, you guys you put into words what we were thinking as a city, and that's nice. Well, this is a book, so we weren't really competing with other people in the media in the conventional sense, and we really wanted to, and so we realized the story was the way to tell it. And once we did that, it freed us. And we also at the same time came to that conclusion because like the story just bears out the arguments that you're saying. I mean, we didn't sit there and say we're writing a book that'll be really useful when defund the police becomes an inexplicably mainstream conversation, but it just happens that way because the book shows a really exceptional example of corruption. Like I think that it's pretty high up there in terms of corruption. It's a little different than Workaday police corruption, which is still terrible. So there's that. So just by showing it, it kind of proves those points. And then it sort of just got less and less didactic. And I think in some ways, as we were messing with it and writing it and rewriting and editing it, we kind of were worried that maybe people were going to be like, oh, maybe this book isn't as sort of academic and obnoxious as I would have thought from those guys. But we thought that was important because just telling the story hadn't been done. And we thought that our understandings of the law enforcement, where our politics are coming from, were incredibly useful to a true crime narrative. Like Baynard said earlier, like, let's tell a true crime story that's not cop worship or isn't sort of this obsession with like, you know, the ugly, gory details of a murder or the sort of carceral things that are swirling around even some of the crime fiction and crime nonfiction that I think I really enjoy reading. And so we sort of saw a way to make our points through the story because the story bears out the arguments for us in a certain way. And also that it also was also important that once you start talking to people that were affected by this, it's very different when you have a lot of words or a whole chapter or a whole book to ask those people and spend time with them. And it's a little different than a 1,200 word or 1,800 word piece where you're sort of, okay, I'm going to talk to someone, but I sort of have to have a news peg. We didn't have those issues. And so it started also become about like sort of really hearing these people's stories out and showing them accurately and as fully as we could.
And I mean, it was fascinating this morning. I did this mini radio tour where I talked to like 5 or 6 radio stations around the country that were really mainstream and really even right-wing, their sports shows and things. And we'd mainly talked to a fairly left-leaning press so far who have asked us about defunding the police, abolishing the police. And these guys just all asked about the story and just really focused on how crazy of a story it was. But were really compelled by it. And so I thought, I mean, on the one hand, there's a real advantage there. You're able to sneak in some ideas by telling this kind of compelling story. On the other hand, I do worry, you know, there are cops who love training day and model themselves on it. Some of these cops, and there's a certain worry that cops in other cities will read this and maybe glorify or idolize these guys or steal some of their tricks or something. But it was super important to follow, like Brandon said the other day, that I thought was right, reminded me of follow. It was like following with a camera through the story. And we felt like if you followed it with a camera, that people would get the ideas and they'd be able to think through it. And we thought it gave us, I mean, the cynical part of that of being journalists and having to make a living is that we didn't expect this moment, of course, but that you can then lay out, you can write op-eds and stuff, elucidating the ideas of the book, have conversations like this and elucidate them while also having the book just be the thing itself and stick really close to the experience of that particular time with those people. But, you know, if someone dismisses it because of who we are, I mean, fuck them. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm going to add one more thing and then I'll get out of the habit of always adding a third response. It's like the camera idea was really important because it kind of was the same as like the idea of like exploring these like assumptions and reversing these expectations with characters, making the defense attorneys kind of the protagonist or quasi-hero. Was there's so much stuff that says, oh, you just need to show the cop's side of things, or, body camera footage is kind of inherently, for the most part, a cop's point of view. And so I sort of thought it was interesting and subversive to really hang out with these cops, which we could do by doing a ton of reporting and also having video, wiretaps, things like that. And so in a way, it's like we're just hanging out with the cops the way a lot of propagandistic media does it. But by hanging out with them and also having access to recordings and things they didn't know they were being recorded, we can kind of show, I think, I don't know how, I can't say it's like a full picture of that, but you get some sense of how these cops act and talk and hang out when they don't think they're being recorded. And so the story is from the cops' point of view, essentially, or it's right there with the cops, not their point of view, but by just hanging out with them, you see how fraught the entire endeavor is.
And so that actually brings up one of the things that like sticks out to me the most from reading the book, which was that how normalized it was, right? And so like as a person who's an organizer, and I live in Baltimore like everyone else, right? And this is a city that's actually driven by culture, right? From little things about like, you're not really Baltimore if you didn't, come from a Baltimore high school, right? That just reminds me of like how deep the corruption, like what we didn't see, right? Like just how normalized corruption was as a part of their culture, right? Like it's literally their culture. And it was just astounding, right? Like in the way that we, normalize the fact that we know the police are going to follow us after an action or things like that, right? Like, but that was just like more, had deeper impact, right? Like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we had one thing on that. We have a thing coming out in the Intercept sometime this week that really sort of takes out some of the stuff at the way they targeted violence interrupters, and it really shows and looking at violence interruption programs as an alternative to policing, and that the police, by just following them, that it shows that the police knew they were an alternative to police because they were trying to specifically to target them, not only to get information, but also it was good PR for police if it was bad PR for their opponents. And yeah, those kinds of parts of the culture really are I think deeply ingrained, the us versus them that they bring to it.
Yeah, and like early in the book, you get that kind of indoctrination into a lot of the ideas, these things like door pops, which is just especially wildly unconstitutional action in which you drive up to someone or a bunch of black men on a bus stop, you screech your tires, you pop your door, people run, it's an unmarked car. Then you tackle anybody who's running, try to see if they have guns or drugs. If they have a gun, you arrest them for the gun. If they have drugs, you keep the drugs and you sell them. Like that was happening by this task force up to 50 times a night, one of the members testified. So that's the sort of normalization of that corruption. And then you hear the little things like stealing built trust, there's things like that, and that kind of normalization of it, we thought by showing that in dialogue and through scenes, maybe you'd feel it a little more, maybe, because in a way, like maybe we all kind of understand, especially right now, I think there's a real mainstreaming of like, maybe this whole police project is fraught, like we kind of all understand it intellectually. We hope that the story kind of made you feel it and see it play out the way it might, especially in a movie or a TV show or something like that, or a good true crime book or crime book.
So
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Jenny Egan, who's a public defender here in Baltimore City.
So I have two questions. You outlined earlier how Trump's election in 2016 reduced federal prosecutors' appetite to investigate corruption in BPD. As Trump, as recently as this week, threatens to send federal troops into the city, I wanted to know if you could talk briefly about the coordination between these units and federal law enforcement. Why is it that so many of these officers and these units had such close ties to DEA and ATF agents? And what does that tell us about federal law enforcement corruption? And then my other question goes to, how do you keep this from becoming exceptionalism? So you talk about how they say it is, these 7 officers or these 12 or these 15 or the 30 that are mentioned in your book, 30 or so. but the everyday corruption, most of them describe that they regularly stole, lunch money and small bills off corner boys and drug dealers. I wonder, when you have a book like this that captures a direct moment in time, how do you push back against the audience's desire to close its eyes and pretend that any of those practices have ended? Because literally nothing that you've described in your book have I not seen this year, or as recently a sneak and peek that I dealt with all day today, right? BPD did a sneak and peek today. And how do we keep the importance of your book from becoming or having it seem like it's exceptional?
Yeah, I mean, those are both amazing questions. I think that on the first thing about the federal law enforcement, I mean, 100%, the time period that the book is taking place is when BPD, as murders start rising in 2015, they create the war room specifically to work with bring federal agents in and work with federal agents to get intelligence, share intelligence. Wayne Jenkins was using that federal intelligence to go and rob people. Information, like the book starts with the case of Maurice Stevenson. There was a federal wiretap on him at the time that this happened. And so he just like swooped in and, but they were doing the same things he was doing, except he took it to this, in this case, this crazy robbery. But, even in that, the Haida agent, the guy the federal task force guy who comes and gets the money who testified in the federal trial against them, has since been suspended. And he went to training with Wayne Jenkins. He was supposed to be, he's Taylor's defense in it. Hey, I was off with Glover. I couldn't have taken any money. And he's been suspended. They haven't released any details why since then. They get real offended when you ask, how did you have this guy testify when you knew he was involved with Jenkins this way? And another guy, Rickman, who pops up in the thing, who had worked with Jenkins in the BPD for a long time, went to a federal task force, and they're getting drunk at 3 a.m. and calling up Gondo, rapping, being insanely racist, I imagine, at 3 a.m. And so these, federal agents are hanging out with Wayne Jenkins drunk at 3 a.m. And it's not only federal agents, but the judges who are signing the warrants. I do think there's a huge amount of corruption in federal law enforcement agencies that works with them closely, and partly because, similar to what Larry said about the way people rise through the ranks within BPD, but because of the way that people move on to federal task forces. When Allers left GTTF, he went to a DEA task force. And so I think that they work really closely like that, and it causes those same kinds of things. And I mean, that leads to your second question, which is, we thought a lot about that, because there is a level at which Jenkins especially was particularly devious, or Gondo maybe was particularly loyal to his childhood friend in a way that made things complicated for him, that sort of led them to have their downfall ultimately. But we also really tried to make clear that this is a logical extension of policing, that this isn't just what happens in Baltimore. I mean, like you're talking about a sneak and peek today, that they still do this, but that this is something that every police department could be facing, because this is what policing is. This is what policing leads to. And these are the people that we had wiretapped conversations to listen to what they said about it, that we had bugs, that we had all of this stuff where they were dumb enough on their body cameras to steal cocaine out of a car on the camera, or to break into someone's house. And so it was a case where we could look at that, but it is, it is about policing itself. And we do hope that people don't just see this as these crazy cops were bad apples, or whatever that whole thing is, while they ignore that the bad apples ruin the barrel, is the saying.
Yeah, I'll add two things. I think that the sort of collaboration between like local and federal officers is kind of the same kind of like magical thinking that created the task force, this idea that like, we just need to like collaborate. It's like this very neoliberal idea of like partnerships, like the TED talking of policing. Like we just have these big ideas about policing, you know, and then we get the Bloomberg and all these people to come in and give it a lot of money, and we have panels and like, so it's kind of using the kind of, you know, sort of neoliberal tech speak that exists everywhere towards policing. And then it really is supposed to impress you and be like, yeah, collaboration, that's great. And I think that it's at the same time, it's all sort of a way of just not reckoning with the central, really big problems with policing. So rather than do extreme reforms or defund and those sort of things and really move this whole thing around, we're just like, oh, it just hasn't been like TED talked enough, you know, like it just hasn't been like, we just haven't thought of enough great ideas, you know, like, so there's kind of that. So I think that's part of the federal thing. And so it's like, so it just repeats the same problem. So if the early 2000s problem in Baltimore was cops are arresting everybody for bullshit all the time, the fix in the mid 2000s was arrest certain people for bullshit all of the time. It's like, it didn't really fix the problem. And then I think you start to see these federal, you know, and of course it coincides with the Obama era. So this idea that like policing could be nicer, and this isn't, you know, the Iraq war presidency of Bush doing this. It's Obama. Don't worry about it. So I think there's that. And then in terms of this exceptionalism thing, which, I mean, I think Baynard, it's like, you know, we spend a lot of time debating with each other in, I think in what feels like really good ways of just kind of being like, did you think of this? Did you think of that? Kind of nagging each other. And so we really thought a lot about this thing of like, we do, by focusing on this task force and this very specific time period, fall into maybe the trap of indulging the sort of exceptionalism of this crew. Now, the narrative, the storyteller in me says, well, they were exceptionally corrupt, and it's an exceptionally compelling story that has exceptionally like good examples of why policing is fraught, why, and you know, and just the problems with living in an American city like Baltimore. And then I think the defense attorneys and the lawyers kind of hopefully push some of that belief in exceptionalism, bad apples away, because what you really see in this story is lawyers saying, we knew this was happening. We saw it. We told you about it. We wrote letters. And so I hope, so you get sort of there's a long tail of this corruption that we trace through these officers. And then there's sort of these concentric circles of corruption that swirl around them. And I think through listening and showing attorneys dealing with this, I think that hopefully shows a little bit of the idea that it wasn't just these guys. It wasn't just this time period. But yeah, that's a real concern when you tell a story in this way, when you're not doing a sort of, you know, 300, you know, thousands of feet up in the air kind of story, really being deep with someone, that you're gonna indulge the exceptionalism thing. And I hope we countered that. I hope we certainly tried.
I mean, it's fascinating because that question is the other side of Lisa's question about how we avoided that with Ivan as in the protagonist role. And it's interesting that and this isn't to flatter you, but it's interesting that the answer to both was your office, was the Office of the Public Defender. Its role in the book sort of dealt with both of those in allowing, with Natalie and Debbie going through all of the cases and thinking of all of the officers that they'd seen this with. That was one way to try to show that there were a lot of exceptional lawyers and there were a lot of exceptionally bad cops. And so I think it was really important to us to have the Public Defender's Office in there for that reason specifically.
All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Stuart Schrader, the author of Badges Without Borders, for our next question.
Thanks. I just want to, you know, congratulate you. This book is really fantastic, and it just does a great job of both, you know, portraying this incredible narrative, but also I think actually helping us to think more broadly about policing in the United States. You know, and I think that one of the things that the book does quite well is exactly what we're talking about, which is to show that even though this is a wild story with wild characters, a lot of what was happening in this was the result of, a political strategy of crime suppression that was approved, at the highest levels within the Baltimore City government and within the police department. But I guess I wanted to ask a question that kind of, looks at some of the other effects of what the gun trace task force and more broadly these figures that you look at, what the results were. And that is basically just to ask how increased amounts of violence, of property crimes, and all these rippling consequences happened in Baltimore City and beyond after and during and after the scandal. Because I think it's important to recognize that as we talk about this particular scandal and of course the prosecutions that resulted, that is remarkable, but the consequences are still with us. And to the extent that Baltimore City is on the national radar increasingly, every day with Trump's talk about it, as a city with a crime problem, I think it's important to recognize, and I think this book really helps us understand that policing itself has created some of these conditions. Policing itself is criminogenic in this city. And so I'd just like to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's really interesting is, some of the things that I was reading when I was doing the reporting to kind of, expand beyond policing in Baltimore was a lot of stuff about Israel and Israeli Defense Forces, which ties to your book, Stuart. I thought a lot about, we talked about Deleuze and Guattari and those kinds of ideas. There's an SS group that I thought about a lot called the Dirlewanger Brigade, which was mostly people that were criminally insane or deemed that way, who were then given weapons and told to go out and fight, and they crushed the Polish resistance. I'm not comparing these officers to the SS, but what I'm trying to say is like the focus is this counterinsurgent idea that you're talking about as well. And so for us, the one reason I think Baltimore is in the news in this way is because this city did what a lot of other cities are doing now. We did it 65 years ago through a number of complicated factors that just we were ahead on this. And so that kind of fear and concern about people rising up, people saying no, is now national instead of sort of these pockets such as Ferguson, Baltimore. So why that's kind of important to us, I think, is that, the first lines of the book is Baltimore almost had a revolution. And so we really thought of these officers as counterinsurgents, which really, again, ties to Stuart's book, which everyone should read also, it's great. But so that idea that like they're counterinsurgents, and so they're trying to regain control and push down an insurgency. And you do that by any means necessary. And so in terms of crime specifically, the chaos that this unit created, but also just plainclothes units in general, drug cops create, going, see it on The Wire, you see it in Clockers, things like that, was just sort of really unleashed in the aftermath of the uprising here. And the impacts on the crime there and how they created crime, not only from the fact they were actually doing crimes, but that they were jacking people up and taking their drugs, or they were just causing people to be scared. You never know when you're at a bus stop and an unmarked car is going to come up and jump out on you. Those things traumatize communities, they scare communities, they create paranoia, and they create chaos. This is kind of a really weird example, but I was talking to a very sort of just right-wingy guy at a bar back in January or so. And I described this to him just like shooting the shit at CVP. And he thought of the movie Sicario, which everyone's familiar with, this drug war kind of action movie. But the center of Sicario, although that's a really fraud and quasi-fascist movie, is this idea that in that movie, the CIA just is like, yeah, we just go to Mexico and fuck shit up, and then we let them play it out. I think that's central to plainclothes strategy, especially in the aftermath of an uprising here.
Yeah, and I think that, people are asking as crime is increasing in the wake of calls to reform, defund, abolish police departments in other cities as well. And people are immediately using it as propaganda to say, look, we need more police. Look how that seems intentional, that the more the crime there is, the better it is for police, not the worse it is for police. Every year that there's more crime there, we need more money. What we really need is more. And after $500 million a year, and for the last 5 years, over 300 murders, that's something that clearly isn't working. But what we do is throw tons more money. Whereas if one person dies on a ceasefire, we can say, oh my God, this doesn't work. Oh, and Safe Streets doesn't work. Someone got killed, and yet they have almost no funding. And so, I mean, we looked at a case like there was one guy who they stole $10,000 from, and he ended up getting murdered as they followed him from his court date for the thing. And it was a different debt, but all of the disruption when they were stealing drugs, stealing money, no one had paperwork. You had to prove to your guy that oh no, I didn't take that. These cops took it from me or whatever. And so I like that word you use, criminogenic. It's something we've been thinking about a lot without that word for it, but it really is the amount of crime that I think police are causing in these cities is hard to, it's hard to calculate because it's all covered in stuff, but it's also hard to overestimate. I think that specifically when reform is called for, there are spikes in crime, and then they say, look, you need us. And that really, that seems like a perfect counterinsurgency kind of tactic.
I'd just add real quick too, so Baynard and I have been really deep in thinking about violence interruption and the concepts behind that, because we're writing this article about safe streets. And the central ideas of the Cure Violence Safe Streets model is that violence is a contagion. It's a behavior you can curb if you do the right things, but it grows if it's, and so I think about that in terms of this, because what the guy who sort of created the program, this guy named Gary Sletkin, told me was, the cops are part of that cloud of violence too. And now we want to be really careful to not do the thing of being which you've seen after the uprising, where Commissioner Kevin Davis said, well, the cops have PTSD too. That's absolutely true. I don't want to downplay or dismiss that idea, but cops are also are not held responsible for their violence and things like that. And so I think this idea that cops want to paint for example, Baltimore as this war zone that they can't be helped, that needs to be just crushed by more and more counterinsurgent police. And yet they're not willing to reckon with the effects or the ideas or the concerns surrounding that violence to them. It kind of creates it's kind of an impossibility. And so I think those things tie to it too, that you have police that are in the same cloud of violence and part of that as well. The idea that they wouldn't also catch this contagion of violence themselves, it just doesn't parse. And then you've seen this recently with, there's some officers in New York that I think were claiming PTSD, which again is true, but that kind of generosity is never given to whole populations of people that have been traumatized by police for decades.
And I mean, one last thing on that, the way that we readily talk about slowdowns, that all of the sort of tough on crime people here are oh, the crime rose after Freddie Gray because the police were, and we treat that as some acceptable thing rather than as police trying to leverage violence. We're going to create chaos and then we're going to just sit back, like the comparison Brandon made with the CIA. That's something that if any other segment of work sector said that, we would, it would be Reagan with the air traffic controllers or something, and they'd be shutting down their unions. And instead, every time that happens, we just empower the FOPs even more.
All right, so if he's still here,
I'm here.
Cool. I'm going to turn it over to Lester Spence, professor of political science and Africana studies at Johns Hopkins. And I have a beautiful book called Knocking the Hustle on the sort of racial political economy of neoliberalism.
So I have a kind of a two-pronged scale question, So first, kind of bringing moving outward from police to other institutions in Baltimore, and then moving outward from police in Baltimore to police in other cities, right? So the Baltimore question. So we've got a dynamic where focusing on Hopkins, for example, it's clear that Hopkins actually gave money to Baltimore officials in order to get their private police force passed. There's other evidence of kind of corporate, what I call corruption in the city. With the political officials, we've got the issue with the previous mayor and then a few other mayors going back. To what extent, if the natural argument is that the police in Baltimore are corrupt, to what extent could you make similar claims about you could extrapolate from your police case to other sectors in Baltimore, the private sector, the public sector, and then even the private nonprofit sector? So that's the first question. Second question is, if we could come up with, thinking like a social scientist, we could come up with like a corruption scale. We know that probably varies. That is, even if you look at, say, Baltimore, New Orleans, Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Boston, St. Louis, cities that are all around the same size, I'm willing to bet that level of corruption kind of goes up and down. What type of dynamics do you think actually affects the level of corruption? To what extent is your story not just a Baltimore story, but you can easily plug it in to a number of other places?
Yeah, we've been thinking a lot about that over the last days. As we've been thinking about with this Safe Streets stuff about violence as contagious, and of course we're in the middle of a pandemic, thinking about this, and so it's a public health model. If you start thinking about corruption with a public health model, and corruption as violence and corruption as contagious, then that's one way we maybe get to see the way that it spreads. Because not only if another cop moves into Wayne Jenkins's unit, he's going to be more likely to be corrupt because you have this sergeant who's saying, hey, do you want to go off and steal money from this guy? But you also have, if he's doing something and you're doing something else, he's going to be less likely to question yours. And so the more you see corruption, even if you're not asked to join or whatever, the more likely you are to, and I've been reading a bunch of studies on this, the more likely you are to engage in corruption yourself. And so I think when you see at every level going up that you notice, the people above me are corrupt, then you think, why should I not be? One, the same with the question with other retaliatory violence. I'm probably not going to get caught in this city. The clearance rate for a homicide is 30%. And I mean, the arrest rate for corruption is probably 1%. It's just like the chances of getting caught are so small. And then we see that contagion taking it to other cities as well. So Rayam, who'd been a home invader, but not, and all kinds of other stuff, but not particularly a drug dealer, gets in with Jenkins. And because he's a gambler and has gambling debts, Jenkins compels him to start selling drugs for him, the heroin that the bail bondsman won't sell. So Rayam's really struggling. He's a terrible drug dealer. He can't move it very well. They steal more cocaine, and because he hadn't gotten the heroin, Jenkins makes him sell that. So he calls his buddy who's a cop in Philly and says, can you move this cocaine? And that guy's got a brother in Philly that he's already been helping get ammunition and guns and stuff for his criminal activities. So he's like, yeah, my family's into it. And so he gives him that cocaine and then gives him the heroin. And so and then where did it spread on from Snell to go from there? But you can see the way that anytime you come into the orbit of the corruption, and then they have D'Souza, who, they seem to have caught from sharing the same accountant who was cooking your books that Rayam had. So you see your commanding officers are cooking books like this. They're helping you cover things up. In IAD, where Larry looked, you have commanders who are letting things pass and stuff, and you're supposed to be, or you have someone who's investigating their friends. And so on the one hand, it can make it be you engage in corruption. The other one is you just want to look the other way and get out, because otherwise something like what happened to Joe Crystal, the the whistleblower where they really start to target you after that happens. And so it's better to just look the amount of people that knew Wayne Jenkins was corrupt that tell you now, like, oh, I knew that guy was dirty and they're in BPD, but they never said anything is crazy. So I think that, the corruption as a contagion takes it to, in the same way the pandemic or whatever spreads to other cities by contact.
Yeah, I would just really quick add to that, and then I think I want to deal with the private, public, just corruption all around part of the question. I mean, just because, sorry, it's just like we're reporters, so we obsess over something, but really thinking about safe streets and violence interruption, you can see that Baltimore's violence interruption is not necessarily always as effective as it could be because of this corruption and this dysfunction too. And so that's just another example where this thing that's sort of introduced into a city to help a city that has a problem because of corruption, which violence as a form of corruption as a form of violence, as a contagion happens, you're going to have that too. So even things that are, even these alternative methods of policing, or if we won't even consider that policing, or just community outreach, community work, get affected and damaged and warped by that, or they're just either sabotaged by police officers, which we saw that we've learned they did with Safe Streets workers, or it's just sabotaged by just a profound amount of indifference or cynicism about anything other than giving more money to the police. This is an incredibly obvious thing to say on a Red Emma's chat, but we have police to protect property, right? And so that's what they do. And they not only protect property, they protect the interest of people who have property. And that ties to the sort of private, public, all those issues you're bringing up, Lester. I mean, I've covered the organizing around the opposition to the private police force a lot. And those arguments sort of just they bounce off of people at Hopkins that are in charge, or they bounce off of people who just like the idea of more police. They think it makes them safe. They just can't understand that idea that, like, that they're working in the interest of not necessarily public safety. It's kind of a byproduct of these other things for a certain sect of people. I mean, one example of that we pointed out, I don't think it shows up in the book, but I remember we both brought it up around the time of the private police debate, was that when Jamel Rayam, who keeps coming up today because he's particularly colorful with his crimes, was suspended with paid leave for stealing while he was investigated, he was a security guard at MICA. So was Gondo. And so were a few other cops that we know they were working with. And so cops are working other jobs adjacent to their policing job. And we now know they're dirty cops. So the idea that you can create a police force or anything that's separate from the main police force that exists when you're pulling from the same pool it's not, getting from that same pool is not possible. And I think that extends to a lot of things of, I mean, we were talking about this with someone today, like there was essentially a fireworks task force proposed in New York. And so the degree in which we're going to use policing to fix problems there's nothing too small that we won't send police after. And if it's fireworks and it's the same kind of targeted, like it's stop and frisk via fireworks. And we see, and our book has a lot of stuff that's basically stop and frisk with cars. And so there's this direct connection between that and then the political interests of the city, who again, the people developers who want to own more property and already own property, use police and use the presence of police. The squeegee kids is another really obvious example. Somebody just doesn't need to be policed in any way, but is over policed, is a really good example of how we use police to target places we want to change or adjust. And then, the other side of that is that these sort of police officers who are making a lot more money than I make, but are not making as much money as the mayor or the, other people, are then like, so my job is to protect the property and protect the interests and support the interests of the ruling class. Why wouldn't I also just start doing the same shit they do? I mean, I can't sell a bunch of children's books, but I can steal money from dope boys all day. I think it makes sense. It's just a matter of degree or scale, as you kind of said, Lester.
I mean, one crazy example of that's just been coming out in recent days is how the no-knock warrant that was used to bust into Breonna Taylor's house, the information that was given to the drug squad came from a squad called the Place-Based policing task force or something like that. And it was basically a gentrification clearinghouse task force. And so they had fake information about drugs in an area because they wanted to clear out the area for development. I'm really looking forward to seeing some of the more reporting come out and like dig into someone to write a book about the place-based task force, because that seems crazy to me, but it seems exactly in line with what we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think we all kind of have Portland on our minds for obvious reasons. They're essentially disappearing people there right now. And I bring that up because, at the center of that is this idea that you can conflate crime like shootings and other kinds of violence with protesting and property damage. That's really what Trump's trying to do right now, right? And the place-based task force example of that, private police force are example of that. So that's really important to think about that, like what Trump's sort of able to do pretty quickly, mostly because he doesn't face a lot of opposition. There's a media that's very complicit in reproducing his lies and not challenging them. We have a lot of ineffectual Democrats in power, but all those things lead to this moment where Trump can sort of find a way to finally, Baynard was saying this to me today, it's really Nixon war on drugs style thing, like get the hippies, get the radicals, get all the people once. But Trump's found this really, I hesitate to say clever, but it's something where he could just found a way to make protesting and actual violence that affects communities that he does not give a shit about together and merge them together. And I think that's another side of this. It's just, he's figured out how to do that. And so when he says Baltimore, what does his base think of? They think of the CVS burning, and they think of all the shootings they hear about. They don't give a shit about either of these things at all, but they think about them. And so when you say protesters, they think of property damage, but they also think of shooting. They tie all this thing together. It's really easy to do. And there's a lot of policing and a lot of policing strategy that's pushed people's minds in that way already and suggested that to them. But then I also think that something like this place-based task force or whatever is like kind of, somehow to me, I don't know, maybe I'm overstating it. Somehow to me, that's just especially nefarious. Like, we're going to just remove even the veneer of that this isn't for gentrification purposes. It's kind of wild and terrifying.
If I could, Brandon, just kind of duck in real quick. It's really important to mention that all of these cities that Trump targets are Black cities. Like, he talked about Baltimore yesterday, and Baltimore hasn't even really been doing anything. There's been protests, but they've been pretty non-eventful. So I think that it's really important to note that a lot of this is racialized violence against Black people. And just wanted to throw that in there real quick.
Yeah, 100%. I think that, we were talking about this today, that, the stuff that they're doing in Portland is what police do in Baltimore every day. And it takes a special federal police to be able to do that to white people in Portland. But regular BPD does that to Black people in Baltimore every day. And one reason I think that, and we're white reporters, obviously writing this about a Black city. And one of the things I think we came to really understand of why white people specifically miss so much of what's happening with policing is because we think with the same logic that police think. We've been trained to think with that logic that the law is there to protect us, but not to bind us in any way. And the law is there to bind other people, but not to protect them in any way. And so police think, oh my God, we have to, broken windows for everyone else. But then you have New York Times columnists saying, but you can't expect a police officer to follow the Constitution and still be able to get their job done. So we're willing to overlook and we have every kind of cop show that says they have to break rules to get it done. But if people break any kind of rule, they can't get it done. And I feel like that there's a real strain in white thinking that takes that same line that's the same as police thinking. And so it makes it invisible to a lot of white America what police are doing when they attack essentially Black cities.
I think that's actually a really fantastic place to wrap this discussion up at. And I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the over 250 people who tuned in to watch this live, which is amazing, and it was great. I think everybody who was busy kind of on the panel is going to enjoy kind of watching the chat replay and seeing all the things and all the people who were here in the audience for this. I want to suggest, I know we could have gone on for a lot longer. I know people probably have questions. If you're in Baltimore and you're on Twitter, you know where to find Brandon Woods and Baynard Woods and Brandon Soderberg. Brandon is No Trivia and Baynard is Baynard Woods. I'm sure they would be happy to, respond to questions, perhaps, in a leisurely pace as they enjoy the end of what I am sure has been a long and grueling pub day. And I want to thank all of our panelists who have been amazing. And I wish, we were all in person, because you all are just, some of my favorite people. And I know
we'd be drinking now.
Yeah,
we would very much be
drinking right now. Oh, nice. Well done, Jenny. Well done. Well done.
So, and I know, everybody has carved time out to, be on Zoom with kids in the other room, and all of that. So I really appreciate everybody who's made this event possible. Let's say if, you enjoyed this talk, one of the great things about when you host book events for amazing storytellers who are fantastic writers is that even though when you hear them explain why they wrote the book and what was important about it, you actually have not actually gotten what's in the book. It's actually a lot, it's a really fantastic book, and everything you've heard today will only make the book better for you. You still have a lot to learn and a lot to, I don't want to say enjoy, but a lot to get out of the book. So please go ahead, buy the book. Please buy it from an independent bookstore like Red Emma's, for instance, but at least an independent bookstore. If you are interested, we have zines at Red Emma's. They're free. If those are useful for you because you can't afford a hardcover and you don't want to wait in line at the library, and I understand the library waits for this book are enormous, which is great. Or if that zine would be helpful in your organizing, if you wanted to get a bunch of copies, hit us up. We'd be happy to make that happen. And again, I just want to thank Brandon and Baynard for a fabulous talk, and thank all of our panelists. So please, everybody, make some noise in the chat that we can all look at later. And
thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks everybody for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Hey, Baynard, real quick.
No problem.
This is the first time I've seen you really since you're the one person in Baltimore I know who actually had it and had COVID really bad. So it's really great to see you. Thank you for all your work. I'm so glad you're here with us.
Hey, thanks so much. That really means a lot. Glad to be here too.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Night.